The rain had been falling for 3 days when Clint Barrett found her kneeling in the mud beside the covered form. Leona's shoulders shook with something deeper than cold, her fingers clutching the edge of a horse blanket, like it held the last breath of everything she'd ever loved. "It's not just a horse," she cried, her voice breaking against the endless grey sky. Most men would have walked away, muttering about women and their foolish attachments. But when Clint pulled back that blanket, when he saw what lay beneath, his knees buckled like a man struck by lightning. Some truths hit harder than bullets. The storm had been building for days, gathering itself like grief in the corners of the sky, and when it finally broke over the Barrett ranch, it fell with the weight of all the tears the land had been holding back. Clint stood at his kitchen window, watching the water run in rivers down the glass, distorting the world beyond into something unrecognizable. The coffee in his cup had gone cold an hour ago, but he held it anyway, needing something solid in his hands, while the heavens opened up and reminded him that even the strongest things could break. He'd been alone in this house for 7 years now, ever since Martha passed, and the silence had become his closest companion, a silence so complete it had its own heartbeat, its own way of filling the empty rooms with the echo of what used to be. The knock at his door came soft at first, barely audible above the drumming rain, then harder, more desperate, like someone fighting against time itself. Clint set down his cup and moved through the house with the careful steps of a man who'd learned that sudden movements could shatter more than just the quiet. When he opened the door, Leona Hartwell stood there soaked to the bone, her dark hair plastered against her skull, her eyes holding that wild look of someone who'd been running from something that couldn't be outrun. She was shivering, but not from the cold. He could see that much in the way her hands trembled, in the way she kept looking over her shoulder as if the storm itself was chasing her. "Clint," she said, and her voice was barely a whisper. "I need your help." He'd known Leona since she was a girl, back when her father ran the horse training operation on the old Hartwell spread, before the fire took everything and left her with nothing but ash, and the kind of memories that burned longer than any flame. She'd been beautiful once, in that fierce way that made men forget their own names, but grief had carved new lines around her eyes, had stolen the easy laughter that used to spill from her lips like water from a spring. Now she stood in his doorway like a ghost of herself, and Clint felt something stir in his chest that he'd thought was buried with Martha, the instinct to protect, to shelter, to stand between the world and whatever was trying to break the people he cared about. "Come in," he said, stepping aside, but she shook her head, water dripping from her chin like tears. "It's out by the old railway line," she said, her words coming fast now, tumbling over each other in their urgency. "I found him this morning, and I can't." She stopped, pressing her hand to her mouth as if she could hold back the words that were trying to escape, the truth that was clawing its way up from somewhere deep inside her chest. Clint had seen that look before, in the mirror after Martha's funeral, in the faces of men who'd lost everything in the war. The look of someone standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing they had to jump, but terrified of the fall. "Please," she whispered, and that single word carried the weight of every prayer she'd ever spoken, every hope she'd ever held, every dream that had turned to dust in her hands. The rain was coming down harder now, turning the world into a watercolor painting where all the edges bled together, where nothing was quite what it seemed. Clint grabbed his coat and hat from the hook by the door, his boots from the mudroom, moving with the efficiency of a man who'd spent his life responding to emergencies, to the kind of crises that couldn't wait for better weather or more convenient timing. But as he followed Leona out into the storm, as he watched her slight figure disappear and reappear in the sheets of rain, like a spirit caught between worlds, he felt something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the weather. The old railway line had been abandoned for 20 years, left to rust and decay like so many dreams in this part of the country, and nothing good ever happened there, nothing but endings, and the kind of discoveries that changed everything. They walked in silence through the mud and the rain, their footsteps swallowed by the storm, their breathing visible in small puffs of white that disappeared as quickly as they formed. Leona moved ahead of him with the determined gait of someone who'd already seen what waited at the end of this journey, who'd already felt the impact of whatever truth lay hidden in the grey morning light. Clint followed, his heart beating a rhythm that seemed to match the falling rain, each step taking him closer to something he couldn't name but could feel in his bones. The way animals sense earthquakes before they happen, the way the air changes before lightning strikes, and somewhere in the distance, barely visible through the storm, he could see a dark shape covered by a blanket, still and silent as a gravestone. When they reached the covered form beside the rusted railway tracks, Clint could see why Leona had come to him, why she couldn't face this alone, why her hands shook as she knelt in the mud beside what was clearly the body of a horse. The animal lay on its side, covered by an old horse blanket that had seen better days, the fabric dark with rain, and something else that Clint didn't want to think about too closely. Leona's fingers traced the edge of the blanket, with the tenderness of a mother tucking in a child, her touch so gentle it made Clint's chest ache with recognition. He'd seen Martha touch their stillborn son that same way, with that same desperate love that refused to acknowledge the finality of death. "I found him this morning," Leona whispered, her voice barely audible above the rain. "Just lying here, like he was waiting for me." The horse had been magnificent once. Clint could tell that much from the size of the form beneath the blanket, from the way Leona's grief seemed to fill the entire landscape around them. This wasn't just any horse. This was something special, something that had mattered in ways that most people would never understand. Clint had grown up around horses, had spent his life working with them, and he knew the difference between an animal and a partner, between livestock and family. The way Leona sat beside this one, the way her whole body seemed to curve around the loss like a question mark, told him everything he needed to know about what this creature had meant to her. "What was his name?" he asked, crouching down beside her, feeling the cold mud seep through his jeans, feeling the rain run down his neck like ice water. "Thunder," she said, and the word came out broken, split down the middle like kindling. His name was Thunder. She looked up at Clint then, her eyes red-rimmed and wild, and he could see the story written in her face, the years of training together, the early mornings and late nights, the way this horse had been her anchor in a world that kept trying to wash her away. "He was all I had left," she continued, her voice growing stronger now, fueled by the need to make him understand. "After the fire, after everything, he was the only thing that survived. The only thing that remembered what our life used to be like." Clint felt something twist in his stomach, a recognition that went deeper than sympathy, deeper than the polite concern of a neighbor helping a neighbor. The rain continued to fall around them, creating a curtain of privacy that seemed to separate them from the rest of the world, as if this moment existed in its own pocket of time and space. Leona's hands moved to the edge of the blanket, her fingers hesitating there like someone standing at the edge of a precipice, knowing that once they stepped forward, there would be no going back. "I keep thinking he's going to get up," she said, her voice so quiet Clint had to lean closer to hear her. "I keep thinking this is just one of his games, that he's just resting, that if I wait long enough he'll open his eyes and nicker at me the way he always did when I brought him apples." But the hope in her voice was heartbreaking. The kind of desperate hope that clings to impossible things because the alternative is too terrible to accept. Clint had buried his share of horses over the years. It was part of ranch life, part of the cycle that every man who worked with animals had to accept. But this felt different, heavier somehow, weighted with the kind of significance that transformed a simple death into something approaching the sacred. He could see it in the way Leona held herself, in the way she spoke Thunder's name like a prayer, in the way the very air around them seemed to vibrate with loss. "He was beautiful," she whispered, and Clint could hear the past tense hit her like a physical blow, could see the way it made her shoulders curl inward, as if she was trying to protect herself from the reality of her own words. the most beautiful thing I ever saw. And now, let me see him, Clint said gently, reaching for the corner of the blanket. But Leona's hand shot out to stop him, her fingers wrapping around his wrist with surprising strength. "You don't understand," she said, her eyes searching his face with desperate intensity. "It's not just a horse. It's not just... He was everything. He was my family, my future, my..." She stopped, unable to find words big enough to hold what thunder had meant to her, what his death was taking away. Clint looked down at her hand on his wrist, at the way her fingers trembled against his skin, and he felt something shift inside him, a door opening that he'd thought was permanently sealed. "I know," he said quietly, and meant it. "Let me help you say goodbye." The rain had stopped, but the world still wept. Clint knelt beside the mare's body, his weathered hands moving with unexpected gentleness as he examined the wounds that told their story. Each mark spoke of desperation, of a creature that had fought not for its own life, but for something more precious. The cuts were defensive, protective, the kind a mother would bear. Leona watched him work, her breath coming in shallow gasps, and she saw in his careful movements the same reverence she'd felt when she first touched Star's swollen belly months ago. This wasn't just examination. It was communion with grief itself. "She was trying to protect something," Clint said, his voice barely above a whisper. The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire, and Leona felt her knees buckle. She'd known, somewhere deep in her bones, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that cut through her like winter wind. Star hadn't just died, she'd died defending what they'd both been waiting for, what had given Leona reason to wake each morning since the fire took everything else. The foal that would have been born in spring, that would have carried forward the bloodline of the only family she had left. The silence stretched between them, heavy with understanding. Clint's hands stilled on the mare's flank, and when he looked up at Leona, she saw something in his eyes that she'd never seen in any man's face. Complete, unguarded recognition of loss. Not pity, not sympathy, but the raw acknowledgement of someone who knew what it meant to have hope torn away just when you thought you might survive. His own losses rose to the surface then, unbidden and unwelcome, memories of a wife who died in childbirth, of dreams that had withered like crops in drought. "The foal," Leona whispered, and the word broke apart in her throat like glass. She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice what they both knew, that somewhere beneath Star's still form lay the future she'd been building, the reason she'd stayed on this God-forsaken land when everyone else had told her to leave. Clint nodded slowly, understanding flooding his features like dawn breaking over the plains. This wasn't just about a horse. This was about the death of possibility itself, about the cruel mathematics of loss that took not just what you had, but what you dared to hope for. The wind picked up again, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and distant sage. Clint rose slowly, his joints protesting the movement, but his eyes never left Leona's face. She stood there in her torn dress, mud streaking her cheeks, looking like a woman who'd been hollowed out by grief and filled back up with something harder. But beneath that hardness, he could see the girl she'd been before loss taught her to armor her heart. The girl who'd probably talked to horses like they were people, who'd believed in tomorrow with the fierce certainty of youth. "We'll bury them together," he said, and the words came out rougher than he'd intended. Leona's eyes widened, surprise cutting through her grief like sunlight through storm clouds. She'd expected him to offer practical solutions, disposal, efficiency, the cold comfort of moving on. Instead, he was offering her something she hadn't dared ask for: dignity for her loss, recognition that what lay beneath that blanket deserved more than a shallow grave and quick forgetting. In that moment, something passed between them that had nothing to do with words and everything to do with the shared understanding that some griefs were too sacred to bear alone. The ground fought them like an enemy. 3 hours they'd been at it, taking turns with the shovel, and the earth gave way grudgingly, each scoop revealing more rocks, more resistance. Clint's shirt was soaked through with sweat despite the cool air, and his hands had begun to blister, but he didn't stop. Couldn't stop. There was something about the rhythm of the work, the honest ache in his shoulders that felt like penance for all the times he'd walked away from other people's pain. Leona worked beside him in silence, her smaller frame deceptive in its strength, and he found himself stealing glances at the determined set of her jaw, the way she attacked the stubborn earth like it had personally wronged her. "My husband used to say the land here was cursed," Leona said suddenly, her voice cutting through the scrape of metal against stone. She paused in her digging, wiping her forehead with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of dirt across her skin. Said it was too hard, too unforgiving. That's why he wanted to leave, go back east where the soil was soft and the rain came when you needed it. Clint stopped digging too, leaning on the shovel handle, and waited. He'd learned long ago that when someone started talking about the dead, you listened. You didn't interrupt, didn't offer comfort. You just held space for the words that needed saying. "But I loved it here," she continued, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the sun was beginning its slow descent toward evening. "Loved the way it made you earn everything, the way it didn't lie to you or make promises it couldn't keep. When Thomas died in that fire, when the barn went up and took him with it, I could have left, should have left. But something in me needed to stay, needed to prove that this place could give life as well as take it." Her voice cracked on the last words, and Clint felt something twist in his chest. He understood that need, that stubborn refusal to let the land win, even when winning meant losing everything else. The hole was deep enough now, deep enough for what they needed to do. Clint climbed out first, then offered his hand to help Leona up. For a moment she hesitated, and he saw in her face the war between independence and exhaustion, between the woman who'd learned to do everything alone and the human being who was tired of carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. When she finally took his hand, her fingers were cold and rough with calluses, and he held on perhaps a moment longer than necessary, feeling the fragile strength in her grip. Together, they approached Star's body. The blanket had shifted in the wind, revealing more of the mare's dark coat, the elegant curve of her neck that spoke of good breeding and careful training. Clint had seen plenty of dead horses in his time. It was part of ranch life, part of the brutal arithmetic of survival. But this felt different. This felt like standing at the edge of someone's broken dreams. He looked at Leona, saw the way her hands shook as she reached for the blanket's edge, and made a decision that surprised him. "Let me," he said quietly, and she stepped back, gratitude and relief warring in her expression. He lifted Star carefully, surprised by how light she felt, how death had somehow diminished her physical presence, even as it magnified her meaning. Leona walked beside him as he carried the mare to the grave, and when he lowered her gently into the earth, she knelt at the edge and placed her hand on Star's neck one last time. "She was going to be a mother," she whispered, and the words fell into the grave like stones. "We were both going to be mothers." Clint felt his throat close, understanding flooding through him like cold water. This wasn't just about a horse and her unborn foal. This was about Leona's own lost chances, her own dreams of family that had died with her husband in the flames. The first shovelful of dirt hit Star's body with a sound like finality itself. Leona flinched, but didn't look away, and Clint admired her for that, for facing the hard truth of burial, for not turning away from the sound of earth claiming what it was owed. They worked in silence again, filling the grave with the same methodical determination they'd used to dig it, and with each shovelful, Clint felt something shifting inside him. He was burying more than a horse. He was burying his own assumptions about grief, about the clean lines between stranger and friend, about the walls he'd built around his heart to keep other people's pain from seeping in. The grave was finished as the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of copper and gold that reminded Clint of his mother's hair. They stood beside the mound of fresh earth, both breathing hard from the work, both reluctant to speak the words that would make this ending real. The wind had died to nothing, leaving the world so quiet that Clint could hear his own heartbeat, could hear the whisper of Leona's breathing beside him. She'd found a piece of weathered wood somewhere and driven it into the ground at the head of the grave. Not a proper marker, but something to say that this place mattered, that what lay beneath deserved remembering. "I don't know how to do this," Leona said, her voice small in the vast silence. "I don't know how to say goodbye to the last thing that connected me to before." Clint understood. Before the fire, before the loss, before the world had shown its teeth and taught her that hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. He'd had his own before, a time when he'd believed in permanence, when he'd thought love was enough to hold back the darkness. That was before Sarah died trying to give him a son, before he'd learned that the heart was just another organ that could fail when you needed it most. "Maybe you don't say goodbye," he said, surprising himself with the words. "Maybe you just say, thank you." Leona looked at him then, really looked at him, and he saw something shift in her expression. Recognition, perhaps, or the beginning of understanding that grief didn't always have to be about letting go. Sometimes it could be about holding on to what mattered, about carrying the love forward, even when the beloved was gone. She nodded slowly, tears tracking clean lines through the dirt on her cheeks, and knelt beside the grave. "Thank you, Star," she whispered, her hand pressed flat against the earth. "Thank you for trying. Thank you for fighting. Thank you for showing me that some things are worth protecting, even when you know you can't win." Her voice broke on the last words, and Clint felt his own eyes burn. He'd attended plenty of funerals in his time, had heard preachers speak of eternal rest and divine plans, but he'd never heard anyone thank the dead for their struggle. It was the most honest eulogy he'd ever witnessed, and it cut through him like a blade. The first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky when Leona finally stood. She swayed slightly, exhaustion and grief making her unsteady, and without thinking, Clint reached out to steady her. His hand found her elbow, and she leaned into the contact for just a moment, not seeking comfort exactly, but accepting the simple human kindness of not having to stand alone. In that brief touch, he felt the tremor of her exhaustion, the way her body was holding itself together through sheer will, and something protective stirred in his chest. "Come on," he said gently. "Let me get you home." But even as he said it, he realized he didn't know where home was for her anymore. The fire had taken her house, her barn, everything that had anchored her to this place. She seemed to read his confusion because she smiled, a small, sad expression that didn't reach her eyes. "There's a line shack about a mile north," she said. "Been staying there since everything burned. It's not much, but it's shelter." Clint nodded, understanding more than she probably realized. He'd lived in line shacks himself, knew the particular loneliness of four walls that belonged to no one and everyone. They walked in silence through the gathering darkness, their footsteps muffled by the damp earth. Behind them, Star's grave was already disappearing into the landscape, becoming part of the endless roll of prairie that stretched toward the horizon. But Clint found himself looking back anyway, marking the spot in his memory, knowing that this place would always mean something now. Not just to Leona, but to him too, because sometimes you didn't choose the moments that changed you. Sometimes they chose you, dropping into your life like stones into still water, sending ripples in directions you never expected. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, those ripples carried you towards something you didn't even know you'd been looking for.